Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings.
The phrase pull yourself up by your bootstraps is often used to describe the idea that individuals can achieve success through their own effort and hard work without relying on outside assistance. While the phrase has become a common part of American culture, the idea that success is solely determined by one's individual effort is more myth than reality. There are many factors beyond the individual's control, such as socioeconomic background, education, access to resources, that create barriers not easily overcome through effort alone. While the idea of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps may sound inspirational, it may be a bit of gaslighting. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings, everybody. We're here with somebody that I'm glad to have. I know Greg and I both enjoyed your book, Alissa. You are a remarkable writer, a very good writer, and have written 5 books of nonfiction, 2 books of poetry. We've actually had 3 poets on our
Oh, really? Who's that?
podcast. We had Bill Earhart, who's the Vietnam era poet, and then a couple of the Washington State poets. And they were good. They were good,
great.
good poetry podcasts. People don't read enough poetry. So let me just give you a little background. You've written multiple books. You're executive director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, won an Emmy, and I want to first of all give you condolences. You lost a dear friend, the author of Nickel and Dime, that I think has been a national treasure. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Barbara.
Barbara was my, I don't know what you'd call her, but she was a very close friend. When I first met her, she was somebody who I'd loved her work for many years. You know, I read Nickel and Dime, but I'd also read Fear Falling and some of the other books. Fear Falling is my favorite. And I just had, I don't know, emulated her, revered her, saw her as someone who was fearless and witty, and fearless as a writer in terms of her style, fearless in her range of topics and the humor and moral rectitude that she'd hate the word moral, but ethical rectitude that she went after things that she found wanting, and also that she saw popular culture as something that was available for that kind of critique, which was not typical, especially in like the 70s and 80s necessarily, that someone writing for Time magazine would take, political, find political meaning in things like midwives or in cancer care, the way that it was sort of commercialized cancer care. She wrote a book about that called Brightsided. So she meant that. And then when I met her, we had this incredible talk. And then I sort of started building up the organization with her around 10 years ago. She totally changed my life. I mean, she was a, I don't know, people say mentor. I say sort of more like a spouse, because we sort of begot this whole organization together. So we talked every day for many years, and we had all these people in common, that we were writers we were developing, funders that were supporting us, and like a whole audience and a worldview that we shared.
Well, you're a rich person to have such a dear friend, and and your writing is a lot like her. I mean, with Nickel and Dime, she would actually embed herself in very low income jobs and just express to people how difficult these lives are for people. And that's sort of a general theme of your book, Bootstrapping, Liberating Ourselves from the American Dream. And you take on a problem that or a theme that people just need to suck it up and work hard, and the American dream's there, and what's the problem, and everybody can achieve it, and you look carefully at that and say that might be a myth. Am I expressing that correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a myth in the sense that it's it was initially, when it was coined in 1931, it was our American dream. And it's become my American dream. So it's even a myth on its own terms. Like if we think about what the American dream is, it's sort of been, I say, bastardized or deformed into something that can only happen behind closed doors, in a family or within an individual's biography. It's not something that happens for groups. It's not something that happens for communities. There's a misunderstanding of merit that's involved with it, and opportunity, I think. And also, I think it's a cudgel now that people use to blame themselves, like, oh, you've been given this opportunity, we can all access the American dream. Well, we can't actually. So I think once people know that there's limits to how much of that dream they can actually just easily obtain, my hope is with a book like this and with other work out there right now, people can stop judging themselves when things don't fall into place for them as easily as they would hope or as what they were promised.
And your book deals with different people that we all think, the Horatio Alger story, just come on, young fellow, you can make it, or the Ayn Rand story, or the Little House on the Prairie story of just the individuals that can make it on their own. I don't know if you have followed, do you follow Heather Cox Richardson?
Yeah, I love her.
She was talking exactly like you were with this story of Little House on the Prairie, that these people go out to the West and they're independent and they're hardworking and they don't rely on the government. And she had a wonderful lecture of saying that this was the largest land transfer, of wealth transfer probably in the world, in giving people all this land on the West that we had to kill native indigenous people for. And that the culmination of the book, where they're trying to send the young girl off to college, they're trying to scrape together money to get her a train ticket to go to college. They didn't mention that college was completely subsidized and free. And that so tell us a little bit about let's start with that. Start with the Little House on the Prairie, and what our image of that is, and what the actual reality of the story is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was very inspired by Prairie Fires, which was a biography of her that I got some of my understanding of her from, and obviously from reading the book itself and watching the show, and reading a lot of like secondary material, like responses from readers about this, because a lot of people got the same message from Little House that I did as a child, and my daughter was starting to, was the impetus for writing this, which is we can all do it ourselves. There's this rugged individualism that's possible, that actually it's almost like a childhood dream, just you and your parents, in the prairie, in this totally simplified society, with more like clear moral poles, and dad is like omnipowerful, can easily plant crops, cook, kill game, whatever the heck, like do all the things that men did in the prairies back then. But the truth of the matter is, first of all, Laura Ingalls Wilder had intended these books as an attack on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and in favor of his predecessor Herbert Hoover, who was very conservative and actually either coined or used frequently the term rugged individualism, and wanted to support this kind of conservative libertarian position, as did her daughter, and saw these books. So I called the chapter Little House of Propaganda, because it really seeps into children's minds, this idea that like my daughter's reading this thing, starts to like want to build a teepee. This is super problematic, obviously. Wanted to be us to be Ma and Pa for Halloween, and she'd be Laura, and it was sort of, I realized that the hidebound individualism was being drilled in through these books and through the show with Michael Landon. What was being suppressed was this incredible land giveaway that these folks got, and that's why they were able to exist on the prairie, et cetera. But also that that land had been stolen from the Indians. indigenous people, and then also that they were terrible farmers. I mean, if you look at the biography, Pa could not farm to save his skin, and basically he had to get his neighbors to help him plant, and so he was deeply interdependent just as a person. So there's like, it was propaganda. It was propaganda on many levels. And then the second version that comes out in the 80s as a television show is like almost to me, it seemed like I twinned it in my mind with Reagan. Mm-hmm. Michael Landon sort of looked like Reagan, had the ranch, the sort of bronze skin, the bright smile, the kind of like actorly obsession, cowboy obsession with seeming, again, like completely independent, and extremely white, right? It's like, and imperial in there, like just like Reagan. And I thought, wow, this is like this vision of 80s America as well as the written in the 1940s about an earlier period still. So yeah, I guess this was what I wanted to do. I wanted to bust these myths. I had started to read backwards, seeing them as plaguing me from childhood. Well, Me Too created this reckoning, I think, around texts like Woody Allen or Philip Roth, right? Like, oh, there's this sort of masculine gaze and this like really often kind of bizarre way that women are represented. I was like, there's a really bizarre way that humans are represented in some of these classic books, and like what human experience is, who we should be. And it's not coincidentally, it's a pretty masculine ideal also. And it's, again, very Caucasian. So I think that is this new reading fervor gripped me. And I was like, spent a lot of the pandemic reading these books that I'd liked when I was a young person, a child, and then in graduate school, Emerson, Thoreau. And I was like, I cannot read this anymore without feeling like I have to spread the gospel of interdependence and like, break these things down.
I'm a little bit ticked off at you because my email address is Life of Desperation, and which is which is the Henry David Thoreau quote: "The mass of men leave lives of quiet desperation."
Yeah,
which observes the empty life, unfulfilled work, not enough leisure time, too much emphasis on money, and I just loved that. They that was just really captured it. But you then told me that he wasn't just this kind of Zen Buddhist guy out in his cabin. His mom did his laundry, and I don't know. Tell me why I'm bummed out about my email address after you did an expose of Walden and Henry David Thoreau.
He had friends. I mean, there's even a line in Walden where I had, or like in his diary from the time I forget if it was in Walden or in a diary where he said I had stools for conversation. So he had like guests coming over during the writing of Walden. He was not the man alone, right? And the only reason that the biography is brought in this section of the book, because as somebody who reads literature seriously, you're not supposed to like bring the biography, and that's like you're supposed to just read the text, and the text will let you know. It's kind of, but yes, Thoreau, is on Chipotle bags or whatnot. Emerson, on mugs. These are public figures. They've also used Thoreau used his own life. He's a memoirist, basically. So, fair game. Let's go after Thoreau. Let's like look at this book and see how independent he actually was. And no, he was not. He was dependent on Emerson. He was dependent on his circle, dependent on his mother, dependent on his friends who came over. I happen to love Thoreau, but I also, he was an actual abolitionist and had great politics, and that was part of what was painful about it, though. I had to reread it as like, oh, this person did spread this, a very literary version of this sort of toxic rhetoric at one point. And the discomfort I felt when I was graduate school in literature and in college reading it, I now like looked backwards and I thought, oh, this is why I was uncomfortable, because I recognized as a young woman without great means that I would not be able to live this life. There was a sort of recognition that there's something preventing me from idolizing him, and this was what it was.
Greg, what do you think?
Well, I love this kind of cultural critique. I think it's so important. I think that we're in a time where that really hits the nail on the head for people. They really have to examine where they got their ideas from. And of course, I'm part of the television generation, I guess the first part of the television generation. And so nostalgia wise, I go back and I watch a lot of old Westerns and television Westerns, Wyatt Earp and et cetera, et cetera. I just kind of am drawn to that because I grew up with it. But looking back, I see the cultural influence upon me. You know, the cowboy, male cowboy riding into town, always on a horse, which is a surrogate for a car. You know, the individualism behind that, and the open range, which means there's no limit to what people can have and own, and the radical individualism of the hero who always tackles these social problems, or problems are not really social problems in his mind. And you just see how insidious it is. I mean, it's just something you grow up with, and you're not really aware of it until you reflect back upon it years later. So for this country today, that kind of cultural critique is just so critical that you're engaged in. And I might add, you know, it's pretty profound, because it goes back even to Thomas Jefferson and the quote unquote founding fathers. I mean, really the essence of this country was yeoman farmer that could just pick up, and when times were tough, couldn't make a living there, move down the road and do it again. So radical individualism is just so profoundly, so deeply encrusted in the way we look at the world today. So I really appreciate, you know, your work for that reason. I think that's really, really critical today.
Yeah, I mean, I saw also during the pandemic, I mean, I hadn't intended this book to exist, but during the pandemic, it became really clear to me that the way we were thinking about ourselves, or I was thinking about myself, and people, you know, Americans generally, sort of these incredible studies, you know, Republicans, sometimes 40%, sometimes 60%, who say, you know, people are poor because they don't work hard. You know, putting the blame squarely back on individuals, other individuals, a lot of blame. We can, you know, look at the very existence of Tucker Carlson as an example that he ever existed and had this much power, as an example of this untrammeled individualism and thirst for power of some groups, right? Thirst for dominance. Why would they fear sort of replacement if they didn't think that they were supposed to have total power, right? So yeah, I mean, the pandemic opened my eyes also about how mutual and dependent we really are. I mean, more than I even had thought going into this book. Like, I thought going into this book that I was going to write a, you know, critique about social class and about, you know, more tempered, you know, like, and less literary. But I started to read this work and I was like, gosh, this starts at the root. Like, this is, and Trump, the root of Trump's lies are that he's self-made. It's just like, this story is actually at the root of all these other lies that have contaminated a lot of different kind of institutions. And, you know, yeah. So
you have to tell, I'm an old researcher, you have to tell us more about that story of the people that interviewed the Trump supporters and how important their belief that he was just a self-made guy. He got a little loan from his dad, and he ended up making so much money that he was quoted as saying, at times I'm getting bored at how much money I'm making. I mean, you know, and that. So tell us the study, the research study that kind of dealt with that, and how powerful that myth was in showing support for him.
Yeah, I really wanted to find out more about this, because I didn't want to just have this one-sided account, you know, like progressive account where I'm just like talking to people crushed by the bootstrapping dream or liberating themselves, and like not talking about the people who really believe in it, because I wanted to understand. So I talked to people who were quite avid Trump supporters, and, you know, often they had a fear of loss, right? They were afraid of loss of their own, usually just middle class standing. I mean, they were holding on to being middle class, you know, what, 70 to 100,000 they made. I mean, 100,000 is a lot in a lot of places, but not in others. And that was the impetus. But the other impetus was that he was self-made. They believed that he was this guy who became prosperous, and they too could become prosperous or stay prosperous if they held on to his coattails. And then I found this study and I talked to the researchers who did it, where they interviewed Trump's supporters and other Republicans in 2018, and the people said that they were voting for him because they believed he was self-made. A large number of the voters said that, and then the researchers laid out the ways in which he was not. They said, "Oh, he got this loan. He hasn't paid his taxes. He's has it's all inherited. This is how it functions.
Bankruptcies,
like either government subsidized or family subsidized wealth." And 10%, they were 10% were less likely to think favorably about a candidate after they learned this. This is just this study. I mean, I think they repeated the results a few times, but I was like, wow, maybe we need to be spreading this word and spreading it not just on our, in these shows, right, but like further afield, puncturing the self-made myth. Because I think, unfortunately, a lot of Democrats also use the Horatio Alger story for their own ends, like boy from Scranton or whatever. And so I think what would be better would be to try to kind of undo the entire myth, because then if we stop giving it this kind of power, we have a chance of replacing it with something more realistic and relatable, and optimistic and community oriented. Obviously a lot of Biden slogans around this kind of thing, like build better, back better, whatever, better together, all this kind of stuff. But I think some of the individual political storytelling is still very centered on, I escaped this, troubling childhood, and now I've made it, and many of them are, right? 51% of our representatives are millionaires or above. So I think this is kind of a problem, though, this story. I mean, I think the story has given room for Trump and other people.
It's kind of interesting that this works because people are doing badly. I mean, when you look at it, you say, how can people buy in on these TV preachers who are saying, believe in yourself and do this and do that, and you'll be successful? It trades on the fact that people aren't doing well. I mean, underneath the floor, the people that are hearing this message aren't doing that well in America. Mm-hmm. And this serves to kind of keep them from looking in the right places, finding the right answers for their problems.
Yeah, but I think, the average Trump supporter, though, makes $71,000 a year. I mean, they're not, I think that's one of these things. Like, I think there are people who are struggling, but I think a lot of them are kind of afraid of loss, whatever the loss means, loss of, hegemonic white power, right? But also loss of middle-class identity, like maybe they'll tip over and they'll be joining their cousins in, some place where they escape from. So there's like that kind of sensibility too, when you talk to people.
Tell me another. I was unaware of Horatio Alger. That's another bootstrapping myth. Boy, he's a real Horatio Alger story. He came from rags to riches, and I knew Horatio Alger kind of wrote some books that were silly books about these people making it. But there's a backstory to Horatio Alger, which is kind of interesting. Tell us about him.
Yeah, so Horatio Alger was the son of a minister in Brewster, Massachusetts, and then he himself became a minister in Brewster, Massachusetts. He was very short in stature. He's like 5'2". I don't know if that's apropos of anything, but he actually was found to have committed pedophilic acts against 2 boys in his church, and sort of chased out of the church, basically. That's what the record shows. And his father did some deal, let him slink away. His father had been a powerful man in the town, and then he what I love is that he then became a writer. This was his penance. So then he becomes a writer, and nobody knows that he had committed these crimes. And he's as a best-selling writer about boys. They're books about teenagers modeled
grooming young boys basically to be successful.
Yeah. I mean, the paradox is, the people who are most obsessed with Horatio Alger stories are probably sympathetic to this idea of all these groomers out there, right? Kind of the conservative QAnon types, right? And there's an actual groomer who who coined their favorite term. It's, you can't make this stuff up. And so, you know, he would go on the Bowery and he'd find these boys, and he adopted two of them, two like orphans on the Bowery. Yeah. And then all his books were the stories of these kind of boys. And they're not really the stories that people have come to believe Horatio Alger's stories are. I mean, people think, oh, Horatio Alger's story is a story of somebody, luck and pluck. That was what one person put it. Luck, you know, little Timmy, little, you know, Richard. There's other Tony, Pete, you know, Paul the peddler. Right there, these teen boys work their butts off, become, you know, middle class, upper middle class, wealthy. No, they meet a wealthy man who takes a shine to them, and they're very handsome. And it's like a completely different story. And so, I mean, they are hardworking, but that's not why they succeed. And so I feel, you know, I thought it was just fascinating. And it's yeah, it's like Jane Austen or something. Like, you know, they marry well in a sense, but, and I guess the sympathetic reading would be like, he couldn't be open about the fact that these are kind of queer or gay stories. So instead it becomes this rags to riches story, because they can't have the driver be the interest in these older men in these young boys, right? That can't be how it happens. So it has to be this other story. Now we know that often power is transmitted through, you know, male power networks, right? So this is
right.
Ironically, he's actually telling the story of more of how power actually has operated through nepotism, through, you know, kind of priming young men, kind of corrupt emotional connections, you know, all this kind of thing. So
mentoring,
but like, that's, yeah. So anyway, it just, yeah. So obviously, I mean, in that case, he was not sort of a fake self-made person, but he was somebody for whom the self-made story accrued to him, because he had this terrible lie at the center of his own biography that also is the lie of many of his stories. Like, his stories don't run on the motor that people say they run on. So that was really interesting. And he's a terrible writer. So I was just like, what? How did this person sell 1 million copies a year? I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Well, are you you're a journalist. You're a good writer, though. I mean, the way in which you tell stories, I think that's why I binged your book, because you tell such good stories. Are you a journalist by college, or are you a literature major?
Was a literature person. Yeah, I mean, that's part of. But like, I love fiction, and I was studying poetry. I was also a poet. So
okay, there you go.
So that doesn't make you a good storyteller.
Well, but it just
often makes you a bad storyteller. Yeah.
You tell good stories is what I mean. You really engage the you know, you're a good storyteller.
So. Oh, thank you very much. But yeah, so I mean, yeah, part of what I realized is that most people who write on literature don't necessarily do investigative reporting. So I was like, oh, I could actually sort of combine these two abilities in one book. So that's sort of what I was trying to do, you know.
Hey, Greg, did you know about the W. Du Bois Black co-ops and all of those that was mentioned in the book? Were you aware of that, of the importance of communities kind of helping people cooperatively, almost in a socialist network? Were you aware of that?
Yeah, that's a big part of Du Bois in terms of, you know, how he looked at Black life. I mean, that's important. Yeah,
because that's part of the bootstrapping myth, is you just pull yourself up, and when you look at our history, we tended to be very cooperative.
There was always the contrast with Booker T. Washington, which that's the kind of Black version of bootstrapping, was Booker T. Washington, who thought that Black capitalism could achieve the gains, you know, that the folks could advance in that fashion. It essentially was a self-help kind of approach for Booker T. Washington, and Du Bois was opposed to that. Broadly speaking, he was opposed to that.
Yeah,
so Du Bois, the mutual aid. So I have a chapter. The last third of my book is called "Towards a New American Dream," and so often in these kind of books, you're supposed to have like this optimistic section, you know, and you kind of hanging on at the end. You go, okay, and here's the one solution. Okay, I'm out. But I just got sort of swept away by the solutions because I felt like, again, like I was sort of doing this literary investigative reporting, and I was like, I didn't know that Du Bois had written these monographs about mutual aid. He'd gone and like systematically gone through the mutual aids, like little mutual aids in the early 20th century. I was like, well, this is interesting. And late 19th, and I think late 19th, early 20th. And also that I was also interested to see that Darwin had been a key influence to the idea of mutual aid. It was something, again, that I was like, this is interesting. Who knew this?
Yeah, because you think it's just like, hey, you don't make it, then screw you, die, and someone else will, survival of the
But
fittest.
no.
But he viewed the idea of cooperation and support as having an evolutionary lifting of the society. And I didn't know anything. I didn't know that.
No, me neither. And that there's these people called socialist Darwinists. I was like, this is very cool. That social Darwinist. So it also shows to me like how ideas again get bastardized in the other way, right? Where you have an idea like Darwin's thought that then gets grabbed in his case by these social Darwinists like Huxley, like not Brave New World Huxley, but I think it's some other relation. And there are a lot of other kind of British toffs who like grabbed his ideas and turned them into this like almost eugenic, very like unpleasant version of Darwinism, that's social Darwinism. It's actually kind of anti-social Darwinism. And then meanwhile, there's this whole other section of Darwin, or another reading of his work, where he talked about things like mutual sympathy and how all the animals and plants that were in parasite plants in relationship to non-parasite plants, and birds and bugs and ants, and just like this kind of totally cooperative worldview here with like mutual sympathy is what he called it. It's not red in tooth and claw, it's the opposite. And so I was like, okay, so it's like the wrong strand had won the Darwin story, really. And that interested me too.
We Greg and I come from the left. He's a little more left than I am, but we're definitely left. And we have a lot of criticisms about capitalism and how, by its very nature, it has a tendency to transfer wealth to very few and make a lot of people's lives miserable. And you dealt with that in your gig economy part of that, and the adjunct professors, and that even though these people are struggling, the system by its very nature is going in the wrong direction to give them a self-actualized, good quality life. Is part of bootstrapping just a propaganda mechanism by these horrible capitalists in the back room conniving to figure out how to make more money and suppress people's resistance to that? Or is that a little silly?
Yeah, I think it is ideological. I think the bootstrapping story is one that's been used to inspire people to work harder, to strive, to blame themselves when they don't make it.
It is part of a theme that kind of perpetuates this myth that it is a myth. It's not true, that you just need to work hard always and you'll be able to elevate yourself. So talk about that. It's kind of great that you are related to cobblers and that who made boots, and that this whole idea of bootstrapping, which again I didn't know this, was always kind of it was a farce. People knew it. It was like, oh, just learn to code and you'll be fine. Oh, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you'll be fine. It was never viewed as something serious. It was viewed as kind of a sarcastic expression.
Yeah, it was viewed as something like laughable. Right. It was coined in 1834, and it was used to describe this inventor. He's like Nimrod Murphy, and it's like, oh, he could climb cross the river pull himself up by his boot. That he was a kind of quixotic, foolish town fool of some sort. That like an inventor in the town, like an eccentric inventor. and that they use this to like mock him, this phrase. And then in later newspapers, they also, Racine, Wisconsin newspaper, they also talked about another person was called pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and it was also like a form of mockery. And so yeah, and then over time, I'm telling you, these things migrate and shift, and like language and idioms are almost like cellular in that way. They're like a kind of DNA, and they start to erode or corrode or co-opted. So that is what happened with that term. And yeah, as you mentioned earlier, it became this way that I think people, a form of social control. So if you think you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, then you're always the one who's not able to do it. And it's a great metaphor in the sense that you literally cannot do it. So that it's one of those like American dream metaphors that time auto-destruct. The metaphor auto-destructs because it's an impossible metaphor to enact.
They pushed it to the point where today, in today's culture, it's commodified, so that you have all these self-help, everything from diets to anti-racism is commodified. So you have a book or a CD or a link that you can go to and find a way, pay for it, of course, to make yourself better, to improve yourself, to make your fortunes in life better. You can talk about some of that. I mean, that commodification of self-help that's so prevalent in everything.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, one of the things with kind of I wanted to include the girl boss phenomenon, because that to me was like the self-made, the feminized version of these kind of bootstrapping thing, you know. So girl bosses emerged in like, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago as like this icon that you're corporate women and CEO women and C-suites. Oh, you're supposed to, you know, have it all. You can succeed on your own. Here's the bootstrap mantle. I'm thinking it's very much what you're saying. It's a commodity. There's books like Lean In, you know, where Sheryl Sandberg said, you know, I continue to be alarmed, not just at how we as women fail to put ourselves forward, but also at how we fail to notice and correct for this gap. So it's putting ordinary readers' self-doubt, shaming them for it, and then like making millions selling them a book, shaming them for it. And then there was a book by someone named Rachel Hollis. It was a huge bestseller. Girl, wash your face. And one of her phrases, I absolutely refuse to watch you wallow. There are brands, women ran brands, like things like The Wing, which is a chain of social workspaces, or Yell Aflalo. It's a clothing line called Reformation. You know, that sought to be the coolest girls on your Instagram feed. And it was all, again, it's like singular founder who, you know, was encouraging people to, you know, in their various media, that they could make it on their own and they could be like them. And one person calls this a feminist fallacy. It's like the idea that just because a handful of these women were able to, you know, achieve parity, that somehow translates into everyone being able to do it. And that's part of what happens when they keep dispensing their messages, like anybody can do this. And also, I mean, if you look at the Fortune 400 numbers, heiresses are the majority of them. So it's like the Walton women or women of Walmart that are on the Fortune 400 list. Whereas, yeah, 11 self-made women made that list at all. So this idea of the girl boss is really beyond exceptional. Which again doesn't mean that they shouldn't be an inspiration, whatever, but you want this inspiration to be delivered without punishment and with an understanding of how much work there's left to do. And it's not just around gender, it's around class and race.
These myths act as gaslighting to what the real problem is. Did you see the Howard Schultz and Bernie Sanders standoff when he testified before Congress?
That was
he's
fantastic.
the head of Starbucks, and he's just, I grew up in the projects. I worked hard. You know, don't be mad at me because I'm so bright and successful and innovative, and I made a lot of money, and that's fine. And God, I just wanted to throw something at the television. You know, it's first of all, he's my age, and when I went to college, I paid $33 a quarter to go to college. I had scholarships. Tell me about student loan now. I had health insurance. I could buy a house without very much support from family. I don't know. It goes back to that whole bootstrapping thing that we are, if you just work hard and are smart, you'll be able to make it. And what's the problem?
But also the student debt thing seemed to was very much in keeping with the bootstraps matrix or whatever, because it was like debt loan forgiveness, hell no, even though none of it would affect the people who were enraged that their loans hadn't been forgiven. Like they were angry that other people younger people might actually have decent lives. And I felt like, where is this coming from? And it's this punishment, like you haven't made it, you're on Snap, you've somehow failed me personally. Like I don't know, it's a sort of personalization on both sides. Whereas if you look at how much college education costs, and I mean, I'm thinking about this, my daughter's 12, like, what are we going to do, right? Like, yeah, that's why I think the last number was 1.75 trillion in debt, in college related debt. And that the debt forgiveness is horrifying to people because they will only want, they believe in the deserving victors and the undeserving victims. So if you're a college debtor, you must have done something. And I think that's the fallacy, again, that you're asking about bootstraps. That is a very efficient way to separate classes, interests, keep people down, So instead of being like, oh, I was in debt and I suffered, I don't want you to be in debt. Or I paid all my loans with a terrible job, I don't want you, 26-year-old, to be in that position. It's like, no, you have to suffer as I did. There's something wrong with you if you're in debt at all. It's like a very oppositional mindset.
Well, that was one of the themes of your book before this, Squeeze.
Yeah.
That these people, they start taking on, what did I do wrong? I ended up getting sick. I have horrible medical debt. I'm going bankrupt. It's my fault. It's my fault that I got pancreatic cancer. That I, somehow, and that just helps perpetuate the system. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing that I found very moving is, it's 1.75 trillion in 2020, by the end of 2021, in outstanding student debt in America. But there's a woman in the book, Sissy White, Christine White, who just, by the way, passed away. She had ovarian cancer. Over the course of the book, she was diagnosed and died. But she was an incredible person because she'd grown up in extreme poverty, abusive family. And one of the things she said, resilience means well-resourced, because everyone kept saying, you're so resilient, Sissy. You're the first person to go to college. She became a counselor, like therapeutic counselor, and had a kind of quasi-middle-class life. And, even when she had ovarian cancer, she was still helping people and, involved in medical research, was the best possible citizen at all times, right? So people were like, oh, you must be an exception. You must be the talented 10th, right? And she said, no, I'm, being resilient is just being well-resourced, which I thought was just an incredible phrase, because we talk about people having to be gritty and resilient, but her whole point is, it wasn't luck that made her resilient, but it was, complex set of factors, some of which was that she actually, her own biography, her mother married a middle-class guy. She lived in a different town, was exposed to different things, so she was not going to be the one to be like that. I am this story of self-making and again, this is back to these storylines. If only more American politicians would be able to say that and say it publicly. And I've been heartened when there are politicians who say, I don't have that much money, or I've benefited from the system. I guess they're worried about, as it happened with Obama, when he was like, if you're standing on a bridge, somebody made this. And remember how that,
right.
But I think the times have changed, and maybe we should start, using this kind of language again.
Yeah. I worked in a school district, the largest, third largest school district in Washington State, and it's Tacoma. Has great wealth in parts of the district. Parts of the district have 97% of the kids are on free and reduced lunch, and they have laundries in the school because kids don't have the ability to wash their clothes. They wash their clothes for them in the school, and they have supplemental breakfast because they wouldn't have breakfast. You know, they have free and reduced lunch. They have free and reduced breakfast. And until you see that level of poverty, until you see, one of the principals said, these families are just one flat tire away from being evicted. The flat tire means they can't get to the job, and then they're fired and they lose their, it's that level of poverty, that you have a different perception. And there's a lot of people in this book that you're talking about, the percentage of people that are just a couple of paychecks away from not making it. That's how how difficult it is. And you've got that feeling in, of course, Nickel and Dime and some of the other books. So I don't know. You're doing just such good service with your writing and the themes that you take on. You're just wonderful. I want you to keep doing it.
Oh, thank you so much. And I also encourage people to look at the site of the organization that Barbara and I created. It's called the Economic Hardship Project.
I'll make
Economic
a link
Hardship
to that.
Reporting Project. And economichardship.org is our site, and Econ Hardship is our Twitter handle. And you can see like a whole bunch of stories on there by people like people who've experienced homelessness, people who've experienced
Right.
Unemployment, SNAP, opioid addiction, you name it, and like what it takes to really survive and what they learn from it. And also a lot of people who just are reporters, and the economy's contracted, and so we're supporting them to keep this kind of feature writing alive as well. So
now, are you connected with Ray Suarez's podcast?
Yes, that's my podcast. Yeah, I produced that.
Oh, holy crap. I was in preparation for this, I was at the gym and I heard that, and I did one of it. It's well done.
Oh, thank you.
Ray's wonderful. He's
thank
a great
you. I produced that. That's like, I wrote it.
Oh,
I wrote and produced it. It's my idea.
I did not know that. Okay,
Going
I'm
for
going to link.
broke.
I'll link to
Yeah,
Ray's.
so that's also another. Ray Suarez is one of my peeps, and I've been, he shaped my thinking. He said this amazing thing. He said, it shouldn't be just the rich doing work, writing. Shouldn't be the rich writing for the middle class about the poor. And I see our job at EHRP is to to rearrange that relationship. So it's like poor people, middle class people writing about their own experience, reporting in general, not just people with bird's eye view reporting on what's going on in America. So yeah.
Going for Broke is the name of the podcast.
Yeah,
It's very good.
Thank you.
I knew you were connected, but I didn't realize that. Okay,
yeah.
There you go. That's that. So
yeah.
Any final thoughts? Any final thoughts? Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no. But Ray is a really great example because and maybe you can even use a snippet of the show in this. That'd be great. He lost his footing professionally because there's a lot of ageism in media, especially like broadcast news and things like that. So he's in his 60s. He couldn't get hired. He got cancer. He also had this accident and hurt his mouth, and a bike accident, and he didn't have dental care. And so he felt like he was falling through. It's called The Sinking Feeling. He wrote a piece for me that we published in Washington Post because we co-publish. And that people really responded to that piece. They were like,
he was a prominent journalist, always on PBS, and then you're saying he ended up hitting some real rough times.
Yeah, real rough times. And so I see part of what EHRP was able to do was we gave him this platform and shaped work around him. And, I see him as like a spokesperson for us, kind of, because a lot of the people that we help, they had whole careers. They were newspaper reporters for 20 years, 30 years. And something went wrong, and, there isn't that super structure anymore to protect them. So, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I learned something every day. Any thoughts, Greg, before we wrap up?
No, I enjoyed this very much. I think it's great work you're doing, and thank you for coming on and sharing this with us.
So anyway, thank you for being on our podcast. It's wonderful. We'll do the links to your book and different organizations, and just keep up doing the good work. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.